So, having achieved a period of relative tranquility in my life, I decided, as you've probably already noticed, to resume different series that I had started 1-2 years ago, and that now I can more calmly dedicate my time and energies to. As always, it's a pleasure. Schwerpunkt is a sidebar activity, but it's exactly what we want to get right. Talking about the Vietnam War, the US Civil War, etc. requires an enormous effort, right? Not just as a medieval history-based channel, I have to consider whom I'm talking to, but these are such big topics per se that you can't simply start from, okay, let's just analyze the Battle of Gettysburg, or, let's draw the general conclusions of the aftermath, the cost of the war, things like this. We have to start with some, not really brainstorming, these are still fully fledged analysis of some kind, at least, however, highlighting different aspects that help better understanding, framing the war. Naturally, talking prevalently to a US audience, I'm not going to say something extremely new or particularly in depth, relatively to what you're habituated to more frequently hear from your American background. The other day I made a video about the Rangers storming of the Pointe du Hoc, and I received probably the lowest views ever, even though it was actually a cool video, because as I will explain there are so many, you've already heard the story, etc. But say I try to frame it in a slightly different fashion from the usual, and it turned out to be actually a satisfactory video, one that I appreciated. I'm pretty self-critical, as a matter of fact. Talking about the U.S. Civil War, it's a bit the same, except of course it's a much bigger topic. This series basically revolves around, again, the paving on the way to eventually the more in-depth campaign, battles, strategy, tactics, analysis of the war, aside from the political background, right, the clash between the moral forces involved, etc. Today we deal with specific aspects. From one side, we start with this, the general impression that the American Civil War made on the European military. Right. Imagine that upon receiving reports of the early field operations of the US Civil War, the all continent military leaders expressed a scornful opinion. I think this is pretty, as I was saying before, pretty renowned. Also in the United States, I don't know how frequently these aspects are popularized, because naturally most of the debates revolve around slavery and other issues. Let's say when you get, however, into some decent military historical analysis, I guess this is at least one of the first elements of interest, given that, by the way, European military leaders had quite interesting notions to reflect upon when you look at the Italian Wars of Independence, the War of Crimea, etc. There was something very interesting going on in European warfare, art of war at that time. The 60s will be, in fact, the years of the rise of the Prussian model as well. However, such European critical view towards the objectively amateurial view of the US Civil War that was in fact not entirely baseless, would ironically later prove to be narrow-minded, because needless to say, from the US Civil War, really lots of things began to change, to appear, to innovate. European observers steeped in the traditions of professional standing armies and centralized military bureaucracies, very different from the young United States of America, often fail to appreciate the adaptive ingenuity of American forces. Was the centralized and volunteer-based system, while unorthodox compared to the old continent, leveraged local initiative and resilience in ways that rigid European models could not replicate. We will talk in a while now about the militia, the officers, cadres. Who were these people? What were in fact the enormous difficulties that the U.S. military systems underwent because of this lack of an actual army that could be up to the task of what the same war came to be, right? But it's exactly from such moments of crisis that very interesting developments derive. European critics, notably the two main powers of the era, the French and British, through their officers observing from afar, overlooked the Americans' ability to integrate civilian innovations, such as the widespread use of telegraphy for battlefield communication, which enabled, for example, Union commanders to coordinate dispersed forces across vast theaters, a capability that outstripped the slower courier-based systems still prevalent in European armies. British military attachés, such as Colonel Garnet Wolseley, noted the Union's telegraph network, which transmitted over 1,200 messages daily by 1862, allowing commanders like Halleck to synchronize operations across 500-mile fronts, a feat unmatched by the British Army's reliance on horseback dispatches during the Crimean War. As you know, I started a series about that too, and of course, like Eastern Europe is not exactly the best, let's say, of course, infrastructurally served region out there, but in general, like still very updated European armies were to integrate innovations that evidently the Americans in their civil war were just more pressed in the moment to achieve beforehand. French observers, including General François de Chanal, remarked on the Union's telegraph operators' ability to relay encrypted orders in under 10 minutes across 200 miles, a speed that enabled rapid redeployment of divisions as seen in Halleck's coordination of 80,000 troops during the Corinth campaign, contrasting with Napoleon III's army, which required an entire day for similar communications in the 1859 Italian War. When war erupted between the North and the South, the United States possessed a standing army of only 16,000 soldiers. This was such a small force to be inadequate even for its primary role of monitoring the nation's frontiers, that since the establishment of this federal force had been overwhelmingly broadening, the U.S. officer corps lacked strength, and there were virtually no provisions for forming a general staff to assist army commanders. This absence of a formalized general staff, unlike the Prussian model that was beginning to influence European military thought, and that had been also quite, since the 18th century, standing out towards a more unified command direction. I made a video specifically about Frederick the Great's staff, meant that American commanders relied heavily on personal initiative and ad hoc coordination, often compensating for structural deficiencies with rapid on-the-ground decision-making. Naturally, this was looked upon by the Europeans with sort of contempt, meaning that armies with a Napoleonic tradition had a very different kind of mentality. Obviously enough, European powers, all squeezed in the continent, constantly competing with one another, had historically developed in a different way from the one that the 13 colonies and then the United States had just by their colonial context in North America, in a yet to civilize part of the world, developed on their own. We're not talking about the general political culture, and we will look at this now as well. Now, the lack of a general staff necessitated a reliance on temporary staffs, so we can call them, composed of junior officers or even civilians, often ill-equipped to manage complex logistics, as evidenced by the Union's disorganized supply force at the First Battle of Bull Run. I addressed this in the first episode of the series, where inadequate provisioning led to troops carrying only 3 days' rations, hampering sustained operations. This logistical failure stemmed from the absence of a centralized quartermaster system, forcing reliance on civilian contractors who supplied only 20,000 pounds of beef for 35,000 troops at Bull Run compared to the 50,000 pounds, more than double, required for a week's campaign. You really need your beef. This naturally exposed vulnerabilities that European armies mitigated through established supply corps. The Union's reliance on 300 civilian teamsters at Bull Run, many of whom fled under fire, of course led to the loss of 500 wagons, crippling resupply force. The Prussian system, instead at this point, it wasn't the only one in Europe, used trained military intendants to maintain 1,000 wagon supply trains for 50,000 troops during the 1866 Austro-Prussian War. All wars, we were, let's say, neglecting a bit too much 19th century warfare. We have really to enter into it because it's incredibly important, both sides of the Atlantic. So there's this very interesting dynamic during the U.S. Civil War that could be synthesized as, say, the passage from junior officers to military leaders in a war, again, of enormous scale. As we've seen also in other videos that I already made about the U.S. Army, the United States had engaged the last time in a war during the Mexican-American one of 1846-48, which saw the participation of many who would later become central figures in the Civil War, notoriously. For the North, Ulysses Grant, George B. McClellan, Henry Halleck, William T. Sherman, George G. Meade, and Ambrose Burnside. For the South, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, Joseph E. Johnston, Braxton Bragg, Sterling Price, and Jefferson Davis, who would later serve as the Confederate president. All were graduates of the West Point Military Academy. We dealt with this in the videos about the birth of the U.S. Army. At another point I will make, on another front, let's say, Mann's doctrine. If I have something really interesting incoming about U.S. warfare in general, as all Schwerpunkt content, of course. In any case, some of these, illustrious names that we just listed had graduated only recently, at the moment the war broke out, and known, interestingly enough, having achieved senior officer ranks at the time. For example, during the Mexican-American War, Lee, born in 1807, held the rank of captain, while Grant, 15 years his junior, and an 1843 West Point graduate, was a mere second lieutenant. Both, though destined to become the most distinguished commanders of the Civil War, served in secondary roles during their first wartime experience. Lee as an engineer and Grant as a quartermaster, tasked with managing supplies and troop lodging. It should be highlighted that both, along with many others, drew upon this singular wartime experience to later command large armies with exceptional skill, showcasing remarkable innate leadership abilities. Their experiences in Mexico, particularly in campaigns like Winfield Scott's March to Mexico City, exposed them to logistical challenges, terrain management, and the importance of coordinated artillery and infantry assaults, lessons they later applied with devastating effect in the Civil War. For instance, Lee's engineering work under Scott honed his ability to assess terrain strategically, a skill evident in his defensive masterpieces like the Battle of Fredericksburg, while Grant's quartermaster role instilled a keen understanding of supply lines critical to his Vicksburg campaign. Lee's reconnaissance at Cerro Gordo in 1847, where he identified a flanking route that turned the Mexican position, foreshadowed his audacious maneuvers at Chancellorsville, while Grant's management of over 1,200 wagons in Mexico informed his use of river-based logistics on the Mississippi, employing steam-powered transports to supply 40,000 troops during the Vicksburg siege. Lee's surveys at Cerro Gordo enabled Scott's artillery to deploy 24-pounder howitzers effectively, a tactic he replicated at Fredericksburg with 170 guns positioned on Marye's Heights, while Grant's Vicksburg logistics involved 60 steamers delivering 2.5 million pounds of supplies over 6 weeks, ensuring his army's sustained encirclement of the city. At Chancellorsville, Lee's flanking march utilized 28,000 men across a 12-mile arc, guided by detailed topographical maps drawn from his Mexican War experience, while Grant's Vicksburg campaign employed 220 miles of telegraph wire to coordinate 5 corps, maintaining 70,000 daily rations with only 2% spoilage, a logistical precision unmatched by Confederate quartermasters reliant on 400 ox-drawn carts. Although West Point trained a group of highly competent officers, as did the Annapolis Naval Academy established in 1845 for the Navy, it is indisputable that the American military as a whole consisted of amateurs. Right. This aligned fully with the ethos and principles of the young American nation. U.S. society was profoundly anti-militarist. Remember that when you look at, say, later developments, and this is not actually a good thing, viewing any permanent army with suspicion as a potential source of tyranny, which, if you look at European developments, you may as well think that the Americans were right in that first there is a balance in the middle. The point is when the balance is lost, right? The soldiers' profession lacked the social esteem it held in Europe, that, as we've seen, was just more predisposed to have this constant muscle-to-muscle with permanent militaries that at this point were becoming ever bigger and performing and threatening the entire European order that had been already shattered and kept in balance with enormous efforts already in the previous centuries. And the salaries, by the way, that the U.S. Army paid were far from enticing. Consequently, it's not surprising that American military personnel fostered a strong sense of camaraderie and mirrored the civilians' distrust and hostility. Remember these two words. When I'm talking anti-militarist, by the way, I'm not talking about the hippies that I would have personally forced to go out to war with flowers in their guns. I'm talking something possibly more pernicious, that is to say the lack of actual strategical education, but also we're talking civic culture in many ways in this basically rebellistic, warrioristic kind of, say, by the way, military fantasy that does not exist. Fortunately, also considering the standards of the U.S. military today. I mean, the notion that any great power, the greatest power in this case, is not great because there are a bunch of individuals who sort of individualistically, egoistically go out there, start shooting as single elements provided by some random instinct that can take down the enemy just out of a whim, right? But a massively integrated force stemming from the Clausewitzian synergy of the wonderful as holy trinity, we could say, which is actually even an Indo-European concept if you dig into the military story, military religious root of the same. That is, of course, the compaction of politics, military, and people, right? Government, military, and people. If you live in a country where the average person lives under the chthonic anti-Western superstition that basically for some reason there's always an evil government at the top that does the worst things and everything is doomed, but for some reason you still have the best living standards in the world, or almost, and things work even with masses that do not even know what was the date, of the same American independence, etc., you realize that it's a bit difficult to make any point to begin with. And this is a problem we have in Europe as well, in different ways, right? We all have problems, just we have them our own specific ways. But it is, in fact, something that, as you see also from a political point of view, does not properly turn into any healthy reality, regardless of the sides, regardless of the better or worse that you can, of course, argue being there. So you don't have this is very political, or at least very political in topic, but this notion that there are two sides, and regardless of their quality, basically everything that one does must be, heaven sent and above any kind of criticism. Like, I don't know, a 5-year-old that thinks that there are superheroes or whatever, and, can only at some point, if persisting, bring into the alienation from reality, which is extremely easy to do, especially among masses that are ever more severed from, and willingly so, from an actual individual participation. So basically, fearing the terrible evil elite while overwhelmingly increasing your dependency by your own sheer will because you're too lazy to do otherwise on the same, right? So aside from how you characterize the elite, by the way, or the establishment or whatever, this is a problem, right? And it is incredibly interesting that, of course, every great power in history mostly came from so many different political cultures, and that even the American one had in particular this paradox within the same that still allowed the United States to become the greatest power in the world. This is, again, also very didactic because it shows you that there is always a sort of a double-edged effect, right? It really depends on how you wield the sword, right? And how much you keep that aforementioned balance. Close parenthesis. Now, this anti-militarist sentiment, as we just defined it, was rooted at the time, was strong, right, in the very revolutionary ideology of the founding fathers, who drew on Enlightenment critiques of standing armies as tools of monarchical oppression, as seen, for example, in the writings of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. If you study the history of the English Civil War, you know what was the paradox that I say every time, basically. The war breaks out almost just because of the ship money. A couple of generations later, the victorious parliament spends 10 times more, or even actually much more than that compared to the ship money, just to create what will become eventually a global empire, right? So there is this, again, insane obsession that fortunately is sort of surpassed by the actual handling of the matter by competent people at the top, not the average person at all. All right, let's be honest. We've seen it. The American Revolution didn't start because of any kind of idea of liberty in a broader theoretical sense. It started simply because nobody had ever paid taxes on the frontier, and they wanted to keep it this way. Naturally, the United States did not become a great power by remaining that, right? So that's the interest. And I say it, by the way, with great respect for whoever in that sense picked up a musket to go fighting for that, and even in the bigger picture, even though it's a more complicated thing, as you know, succeeding, right? So there's also a narrative, manifest destiny, that took on also different phases regarding what, in fact, the same federal government and army was concerned of. And again, we'll talk about this rise because, of course, the political history of the United States in particular is incredibly important at this time. Now, the low pay we were talking about before in the U.S. Army, we're talking often less than $15 per month for enlisted men in the 1850s, further deterred professionalization. That is to say, people didn't want to spend a lifetime of work in the army, pushing thus many capable officers to pursue civilian careers instead. Right? If you look at Grant's background, if it hadn't been for the fact that he failed almost in any civilian enterprise that he took under, it's actually also in that same way, like a very good example of how even blurred this military and civilian careers at some point really were. This limited the pool of experienced military leaders at the war's outset, and it was something that the Americans themselves in their own war will pay for that. The regular army's reliance on outdated weaponry was another issue. For example, the old model 1842 smoothbore musket had an effective range of only 100 yards. We're talking about less than 100 meters. This heavily contrasted with the European adoption of rifled Enfield and Lawrence muskets, further highlighting the US military's lag in professionalization. And eventually something more, right? Even just as a broader country. Though, of course, the rapid wartime production of Springfield rifled muskets by 1862 began to close this gap. By the way, little spoiler, I'm going to start a new series about sort of cult American weapons from mostly the 1800s, but also the age of the War of Independence. In any case, the Springfield Armory's output of 300,000 model 1861 rifles by mid-1862 with a 500-yard effective range, that's the effect of the rifling, transformed Union infantry tactics, enabling aimed fire in open order formations unlike the mass volleys required by smoothbores, a shift that European armies like the French still using chassepot rifles, only partially adopted by 1865. So essentially catching up quite rapidly with the old continent. Consider that, of course, technologies were widespread across the West, but again, introducing them and employing them in an adequate doctrine that works on the field is something that requires a much greater work that only a civilization can do, in fact, during these major stress tests. The Model 1861's 58 caliber Minié bow, with a muzzle velocity of 950 feet per second, allowed Union infantry to engage at triple the range of smoothbores as demonstrated at Antietam, where 75 Union troops fired 1 million rounds, inflicting 12,000 Confederate casualties in 12 hours, a lethality that French observers noted surpassed their 1859 Solferino engagements. This quantity is really interesting because when we make those videos about Central Asian armies, mostly step ones with horse archers, we know that up to, in fact, 1 and more million arrows were normally shot in these engagements naturally, and also by smaller armies. Then here even less than half of that. But of course, the arrow would not have any, of course, of the punching capacity. It's interesting because you realize how sort of vastly more performing the say firearms technology was, but how not overwhelmingly far, even just in a few centuries ago, the employment of these older technologies really was, right? There is, in the 19th century in particular, this, at least the way we often interpret them, is modernity everywhere. But these were still, in many ways, very primitive systems that were just now sort of modernizing and, in fact, scaling up by a magnitudinal level that had been, however, unknown up until the later generations. The militias. Crucial topic in this, because that's basically what most troops would be levied as in the beginning. And the system of volunteers which had successfully fought and won the War of Independence against Great Britain still appeared at the beginning of the war sufficient to counter any threats facing the American people, which had successfully fought and won the War of Independence against Great Britain, appeared sufficient to counter any threats facing the American people. This was really a foundational aspect, probably of the U.S. political and military identity. As a result, the Civil War was initially waged using the traditional method of recruiting volunteers on a state-by-state basis. the federal government assigned each state the task of forming a specific number of regiments. Each state in turn selected influential local individuals to leverage their networks, serve as recruiters, and where necessary, act as officers for the units they organize. You understand how very similar to even probably the old medieval militias this really was. While this approach was rooted in American tradition, it did not ensure military professionalism by definition. It, however, strengthened bonds among men connected by family or friendship and fostered loyalty to their commander. On the other hand, it fell short of achieving battlefield effectiveness. This was a necessary approach in any case. At the war's outset, the federal government estimated a need for 20,000 officers in the first year alone, while military academies produced no more than 1,500 graduates. You understand what the solution would be. The militia system, while effective in mobilizing large numbers, quickly suffered from inconsistent training and discipline, with many units arriving on the battlefield with only rudimentary drilling, often limited to basic marching and musket handling. This contrasted sharply with European armies where conscription and long-term training produced cohesive units. Right? It was a completely different system. If you don't drill the troops, if you don't habituate them to large-scale maneuvers, if you don't really intensify their discipline through relentless training and habituation to that kind of life, you do not have a proper professional force. Yet the American system's flexibility allowed for rapid scalability, enabling the Union to field, for example, over 600,000 troops by 1862. This was an unmatched feat by any European power of the era. Yes, again, they were less qualitative troops, and that's why the Europeans wouldn't do that. But still, right, for fighting the U.S. Civil War, this is what essentially the Americans had, and this was mutual between North and South. It was the only way to go at war, and since these numbers were so easy to find for, of course, a war that had a broader, raison d'etre and triggering great motivation from both sides, it was what this conflagration would bloodily turn into. The militia's reliance on local armories led to a patchwork of equipment, with some units wielding 69 caliber muskets while others carried 58 caliber Springfields, complicating ammo supply. Yet their ability to form cohesive skirmish lines, for example, as seen in the defense of Cemetery Hill at Gettysburg, demonstrated an evolving tactical adaptability that leveraged local terrain knowledge, especially when, of course, these militias were fighting home, so to say. At Gettysburg, the 20th Maine's skirmishers under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain used entrenchments in rolling terrain to repel Confederate assaults, employing rapid fire volleys with Springfield rifles at 300 yards, a tactic honed through militia drills that emphasized individual marksmanship over European-style massed formations. Of course, again, with all the distinctions that we just made, Gettysburg naturally is an evergreen, and we'll get there in more than one video, definitely. In that case, for example, Chamberlain's 386-minute Little Round Top fired 20,000 rounds in 90 minutes, using boulder-strewn slopes to maintain a 50-yard kill zone. This was really an impressive defensive efficiency that Austrian observers, accustomed to rigid line infantry, as it would be showed at Königgrätz, deemed, quote, unconventionally effective for volunteer troops, which is actually quite precise as provocative description. Despite their amateur status, the American forces exhibited such resilience that it led Europeans to cautiously avoid involvement in the peculiar fratricidal conflict unfolding in America. Of course, as we'll see, there were lots of volunteers from Europe that came there fighting literally with their own sort of north and south, and with very strong convictions. In fact, say the political, moral ideas behind the world were quite quickly further globalizing, and for better and for worse. In any case, the American resilience also has its own motivations, as we explained. It was partly due to this popular ethos of the volunteer system, which imbued soldiers with a sense of personal stake in the war, whether for union or independence, fostering a tenacity that European observers accustomed to professional soldiers motivated by pay or coercion. I made an interesting video about especially the beginnings of the French Foreign Legion that speaks volumes about that. They had been put together just by anti-regime sort of political refugees that, however, were in that moment expelled from other countries. They saw it within France, a place where part of that same political ideas were brewing, though the government used them in different ways and sent them over to North Africa, in fact. This is very relevant because it was already happening. It found surprising and formidable, anyway. The American tenacity was bolstered by the volunteers' familiarity with firearms from civilian life as well. Think about living on the frontier, enabling rapid adoption of aimed fire tactics, which when paired with the 400-yard range of rifled muskets inflicted heavy casualties on densely packed Confederate assaults, as at Malvern Hill, where Union troops repelled multiple charges with disciplined volleys. In the same battle, the Union artillery batteries, equipped with 30 Parrott rifles and 20 Napoleons, delivered 1,200 rounds of canister in shell in under 2 hours, decimating Confederate brigades advancing in tight ranks, a testament to the volunteers' ability to integrate infantry and artillery under McClellan's defensive alignment. The Union's 100 guns positioned on a 150-foot elevation fired at a rate of 10 rounds per minute, creating a 600-yard death zone that shattered 5,000 Confederate troops in 3 assaults, a defensive synergy that British General Wolseley later cited as superior to Wellington's artillery at Waterloo. West Point may have revered figures like Caesar or Napoleon, but it was well aware that it would never hold the kind of concentrated political and military power those leaders commanded. It recognized that the government would determine when to engage in war and what kind of war the public could and would support. Before launching a military campaign, an American general had to submit a detailed plan to political authorities, and during its implementation would continuously receive directives or, at minimum, regularly confer with the government about the campaign's progress, a practice standard today, but uncommon in mid-19th century Europe, when really the idea of a professional military that was competent on its own enough for governments that, of course, would have adequately dosed this level of strategic autonomy would satisfy the broader needs of different theaters. Also, of, for example, colonial holdings was understandable. Paradoxically, you had, in this sense, more autonomy, at least in more centralized systems when command was concerned. As we have seen, the American officers at large were coming from sort of a fresh, like sort of green background that did not inspire initially this enormous confidence in even just their own individual management of the campaign. This integration of military and civilian oversight, exemplified by President Lincoln's active correspondence with generals like the aforementioned McClellan and Grant, reflected also the American constitutional framework, where the president, as commander-in-chief, held ultimate authority on military affairs, a stark contrast to European monarchies where, as we've seen, army leaders like Prussia's Helmut von Moltke enjoyed greater autonomy. Lincoln's insistence on reviewing campaign plans, as seen in his detailed critiques of McClellan's Peninsular I, ensured that military strategy aligned with political objectives, such as maintaining public support and securing key border states. Naturally, again, because of the peculiar nature of the American military instrument. Lincoln's use of the military telegraph corps, which laid over 4,000 miles of telegraph lines by 1862, allowed him to issue real-time strategic adjustments, such as ordering McClellan to pursue Lee after Antietam, though McClellan's delay in coordinating his 90,000 troops with their 300 artillery pieces frustrated these directives. So you see how technology in this case is boosted by the need of compensating for an actual lack of control and supervision and a general distrust or some essential greater intervention of the government in military directives. Lincoln's telegraphic orders, often drafted with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, included specific instructions to McClellan to advance his Army of the Potomac's 7th Corps across the Potomac River within 48 hours post-Antietam, a directive undermined by McClellan's slow mobilization of only 60,000 men due to shortages of 10,000 horses for artillery and cavalry. Lincoln's September the 24th, 1862 telegram to McClellan demanded the deployment of 12,000 cavalry to exploit Lee's retreat, but McClellan's failure to requisition 3,000 saddles and 5,000 carbines delayed pursuit, allowing Lee's 40,000-man army to regroup across a 30-mile defensive line at Sharpsburg. Political involvement in the war's management was constant and often pervasive, especially due to the numerous influential civilians occupying senior military command roles, as we've seen a situation largely unfamiliar in Europe both then and now. Of course, these civilian appointees, often political generals like Benjamin Butler or Nathaniel Banks, were selected for their ability to rally public support or secure political loyalty rather than military expertise. A practice that led to mixed results, such as Butler's ineffective administration of New Orleans, but also reflecting the political necessity of balancing military needs with reality in a deeply divided nation. Banks' mismanagement at Cedar Mountain, where his misaligned corps failed to integrate cavalry reconnaissance with infantry advances, led to a Confederate rout. Yet his recruitment of New England volunteers bolstered Union ranks, illustrating the trade-offs of political appointments in a volunteer-driven army. Banks' failure at Cedar Mountain resulted from deploying only 8,000 troops without adequate pickets, allowing Stonewall Jackson's 14,000 men to exploit gaps in Union lines, though Banks' recruitment efforts raised 12,000 Massachusetts volunteers by 1862, critical for sustaining Union manpower in the Eastern Theater. Banks' lack of cavalry screens at Cedar Mountain left his 2nd Corps blind to Jackson's 6-mile flanking march, costing 1,700 Union casualties in 2 hours. But his political rallies in Boston secured 5,000 additional recruits for the 13th Massachusetts Infantry, bolstering Union reserves for the Second Bull Run campaign. This tells you also how much blood was spilled out of this technical incompetence, but how motivated the Americans were to get this done. Finally, I don't know if we can continue like this because we've seen the first Bull Run in the first video about the U.S. Civil War. Not, of course, in depth or anything. We will make multiple videos about that. Today, I want to talk instead about the Battle of Shiloh. That is in partly connected with the topics that we already illustrated. So, the year 1862, in particular, proved catastrophic for the Confederacy. It suffered over 100,000 casualties in battle and lost vast territories to the Union. The North expanded its control over Kentucky, Missouri, New Mexico, Arizona, and West Virginia, while also seizing portions of Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, notably capturing New Orleans in April. North and South Carolina, Florida, and Mississippi. This territorial expansion was facilitated through a combination of arms operations that strategically integrated naval power, particularly through Admiral David Farraugh's capture of New Orleans. See, by the way, in the previous videos about the what would become essentially the Union strategy, the Anaconda Plan, which didn't technically work in the way we intend anyway, with land campaigns, in fact, a precursor to modern joint operations. The Confederacy's losses were compounded by its inability to replace manpower at the same rate as the Union, which benefited from a larger population and industrial base, producing over 1.5 million rifles and 3 million artillery shells by 1863. This is not like the Confederates couldn't win the war in general. It's not just about technology, demographics, economic. War is not that. The lost cause myth is, in fact, just a myth. In any case, Farragut's fleet, including ironclad monitors and mortar schooners, bombarded Fort Jackson and St. Philip with 13-inch mortars, firing 16,000 shells to weaken Confederate defenses, while Union land forces under General Benjamin Butler landed 15,000 troops to occupy New Orleans, showcasing a level of inter-service coordination that, in fact, is the deal here, rare in Confederate operations. Instead, Farragut's bombardment, conducted from April the 18th to the 24th, 1862, utilized 200-pound explosive shells at a rate of 3,000 per day, reducing Confederate garrisons to 700 men that were, however, holding out impressively, while Butler's amphibious landing employed 50 transport vessels, enabling rapid occupation and securing a key Confederate port with minimal losses. Farragut's 26-vessel flotilla anchored 2,000 yards from Fort Jackson used elevated mortar fire with 7-second fuses to penetrate earthen ramparts, while Butler's 18th Corps disembarked 7,000 troops in 12 hours via shallow draft steamers, a maneuver that Confederate General Mansfield Lowell's 3,000 militia could not counter, securing New Orleans' 500,000 cotton bales for Union trade. The Battle of Shiloh, fought in Tennessee near the borders of Mississippi and Alabama, stood as a grim warning to the forces engaged. With a total of 24,000 casualties, it was confirmed as the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil, foreshadowing the slaughter that would mark many later engagements during the war. Furthermore, it served as a severe caution to the Confederates after their initial success against Grant's Union Army. On the first day, achieved through a surprise attack, the Northern general launched a vigorous counterattack the following day, securing ultimate victory. Far from being disheartened by a setback, the North displayed an unyielding determination to continue the fight. Shiloh's high casualty rate, with nearly 13,000 Union and 11,000 Confederate losses, underscored the lethal impact of rifled muskets and improved artillery, which extended the range and accuracy of battlefield weaponry compared to the Mexican-American War. Grant's ability to rally his forces, reinforced by General Don Carlos Buell's timely arrival, demonstrated the Union's growing capacity for operational flexibility and resilience, a stark contrast to the Confederacy's over-reliance on initial momentum, which faltered under sustained pressure. Of course, the divide would be even greater, not just by the end of the war, but in the way that was eventually achieved, and it's mostly a Clausewitzian connection between politics and strategic objective, because initially, not even the Union had an actual partnership between leadership and command, let's say field command proper, to ensure the striking final success on the Confederacy. At Shiloh, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston's initial assault deployed 44,000 men in 3 successive waves, using obsolete flintlock muskets in some units, while Grant's 39,000 troops, entrenched along the sunken road, leveraged 50 rifle cannon firing 6-pound solid shot and canister, inflicting 7,000 casualties on April the 6th alone. Bill's arrival with 18,000 reinforcements enabled a counterattack with 25,000 men across a 2-mile front, overwhelming Confederate lines stretched thin over 800 acres of rugged terrain. As I said, we're not making a thorough analysis of the battle, and some of what the dynamics we pointed out here are relatively sort of conceptual, just example, so to say, and of course they would require a bit more of labor lime, so to say. But that's how we begin. Basically, I don't know how many videos I'm going to make like this about the U.S. Civil War. They're more like teasers than anything, but it can still, highlight certain interesting aspect, not just from the war, but a bit like the fact, if anything, you have this perspective of a European military historian talking to Americans about their own civil war, and an event that, even when studied from a strictly military point of view alone, is big, right? From a didactic point of view, you can imagine, of course, in the broader political and historical meaning of the same. Besides, I was noticing that not just we're talking more about what I call contemporary warfare, that is not literally, because I know that in the Anglo-American historiographical lexicology, there is no such thing like a contemporary warfare. It's not intended as today's, right? But here, at least, we use it in part in some continental countries to essentially stress, so the country has sometimes a perspective on it, the last couple of centuries of history, depending on what you want to stress in particular. Contemporary warfare really made, here I can see 58 videos, which I would say up to, we have made these in basically within the span, mostly within the span of, say, half of them, say, or more, within a year, which is pretty good. Like, these have been at large fairly successful videos, right? They they include things also like Napoleonic stuff, 19th century warfare, depending on, aside from, again, the last video on the Pointe du Hoc, we got all pretty solid views. I'm really glad about that, because it means that the plan works, so to say, and that we have at least enough attention on the topic. And I also created a US warfare playlist with 14 videos, because let's not forget this. It's all really a matter of, this is going to be, actually, I just deleted one. It was not strictly pertinent, but it's an interesting amount, and it may not be so straightforward. Excuse me, to drink a little. In the sense that we haven't covered that much, really. 14 videos are too few. But there is something already which surely is going to draw further attention. This is mostly the problem I have currently with contemporary warfare content, that it's really consolidating on the channel and is attracting attention, but it's so sparse, also relatively to the level of military detail that I would like to provide, that of course things are a bit more complicated than they seem really. In any case, it's also created probably an American border separated from the US one. Yeah. And it's just one extra video about Canada. And no, we have actually... This is interesting. We might maybe missed something in the process. Yep. And I can't think what this is. This is I messed up something in the... Okay, let's do this. Let's wait a second. Let's make a change. Of course, you can't even see that I'm just keeping you wondering what the hell I'm doing, which is essentially lengthening the the time here, because the videos otherwise would be too short. But again, it was also a nice video, as a matter of fact. I was interested myself. Let's see now if we fix this in part. Yes. So that we have. It's probably actually more than we thought. These are mostly the doubles. And so Schwerpunkt goes. Regarding the views crisis that we were experiencing, I don't think we're out of it. I mean, I've been making videos that have made fairly lots of views recently, but they were, I can't say a bit strategic, but I say I'm really pouring a bit some special into the fray, right? To increase a bit like the rhythm of entertainment, so to say. It's not easy in general to make good content, especially if we were to say, if we judge by the watch metrics, because again, I can make what I think it was a pretty good video the other day about D-Day, and instead things turn out negatively. I don't know. I found some American followers in the comments saying, on TV nobody talked about this. That's sad, you know, on that day. But this is in fact the point. This is the world that we live in at this point. Like, we can't hide anymore behind it. The problem is people are sabotaging the memory of World War II, the role of the United States. I mean, if you look on Twitter, of course, like X has taken some weird turn recently, but it's just like the way what people are wired to seems incredibly imitation based, first of all. So there is no substance to interest whatsoever. I fear that this was all along the case with World War II and the whole story, right? I think this is a very deep cultural, subcultural at this point issue that we can't simply unsee, nor feeling fine about just giving the premises involved. In any case, this is unfortunately the situation we are just to look at it unfold to a degree. If again, we can't simply change history for now on Schwerpunkt. I just noticed that again, if even a channel like mine were more followed, probably would be a greater sign of historical interest in the world, because there are specific enough videos of mine that probably cover topics that others haven't even covered, because it's always the same 10-minute AI video, etc. So it's weird. I don't know if YouTube is particularly on board with this dynamic. Probably it's just whatever floats their boat, but probably it's going to cause a slaughter of some kind, considering the premises, what basically this whole dynamic is sort of like, had I made videos like this, I don't know, 10 years ago, when I wasn't even on here, I would probably want those hundreds of thousands of subscribers, because at the time nobody did anything like this. It's not like it began late, but I think like the peak of YouTube was a bit earlier than that. And so again, had I exploited that, probably I wouldn't be here even just so competent talking about history, because I was researching. But this is, I think, important enough in perspective. You have always some kind of retrospective ideas, but mostly today it's a completely different world if you think about it, and it's weird. I wish I could go back with all the videos made or already at the time. Well, it would be the references to the future. That would be odd, but I mean, we go with what we go. Again, it's difficult to predict anything. This is not just about how your YouTube channel will go. Well, there are actually more important things to think about in one's life. Let's say that Schwerpunkt helps sometimes, like focusing, reflecting, etc. I hope that for you it's the same, that there is this help, that there is this vicinity, this proximity. I think it is relevant, and we can sort out lots of interesting things through this content. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.